Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Census Data Seminar for New South Wales. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands that we're meeting on or dialed in from today. For me here in Sydney, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge and respect the continuing culture and the contribution that they make to the life of this city and this region, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today. Thank you for joining us. So some quick introductions to get started. My name is Mark Harding. I'm the Program Manager for the 2021 Census Data Operations. And joining me today is Caroline Deans, Director for 2021 Census Dissemination.
Good morning.
A recording of this session, along with the slide deck that we're showing today, will be available from the ABS website after this session in the near future. So I'll go through a few things first before we get into the data. Let me just outline what we will be talking about today. I'll give a bit of context about the 2021 census. We'll talk a little bit about COVID and the impacts of that and how we dealt with that in the census. Then we'll talk a little bit about quality and the response rates, but pretty quickly we're going to get right into those key data insights and start talking through different topics from the census data for New South Wales, and then we'll cover a few other bits and pieces at the end around our release timeline, what else is coming out, how to access the data, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. Speaking of questions, if you want to ask a question, the way to do that is to go to the website pollev.com. You can see that on your screen now, I hope, and then punch in that code 2021 Census DSNSW for Data Seminar New South Wales, and then you'll be able to submit your questions online there as we work through this seminar. We'll put that up again at the end, but just giving you a moment now to make sure that you have that code 2021 Census DSNSW, all one word, and that will allow you to put up questions that we'll do our best to answer as many as possible at the end of this session. So we do really like to kick things off in our census presentations by just reminding people of what we do to collect all this data around Australia. So a bit of a reminder, I guess, of the size and scale of the census. It is an enormous undertaking. We call it the biggest peacetime activity in Australia. The AEC sometimes weighs in on that, but friendly rivalry that is, thinking that elections might be bigger. But we ask 65 census questions to the whole country. Every person in Australia we want to get data back from, and it takes about 35,000 field staff to achieve that. They travel a total of around 10 million kilometres. We mail out 14 million items to 11 million households, and we answer around 600,000 calls from the public in 2021. And of course, in 2021, I mean, there's other metrics there on the screen as well, but I'll keep moving along for this session and we'll get to the data. But of course, in 2021, we did undertake the census during pretty much the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the impacts and effects it was having on households across Australia. So talking a bit about that, it was a different census from others that we've conducted in the ABS. Census night was Tuesday, the 10th of August, 2021. And that was when external borders were closed, just to take people back and remind you of what life was like then, if you can't remember, which wasn't that long ago, and I'm sure we all remember. But about half the country was in fact in lockdown. And that was around the time of the census, not necessarily on census night, but in the time that we were collecting the census. And in fact, all of Sydney was in lockdown on census night and had been for several weeks. Many other areas in New South Wales had also been experiencing lockdowns in the month leading up to census night, places like Tamworth, Lismore, Singleton, Shell Harbour and Wollongong and Woollahra. And others. And it wasn't long after census night when I think all of New South Wales went into lockdown too, which was still within our collection period for the census when that happened. So that constantly changing environment, and it was different around the country in different states, different areas of different states, made for some real challenges for us in conducting a census. For example, we had to move most, if not all, of our training to virtual for our field staff, which wasn't the original plan and hasn't been the way we've done it in the past. We also had travel restrictions between states and territories and within lockdown areas, which created challenges for us in moving our field staff around the country and into remote communities and even into neighbouring local government areas and things in New South Wales and Sydney. So ABS had a COVID safe plan, detailed how we would deliver the census, how we'd keep our people safe in the field, how we keep the community safe in line with government health orders, and we enacted that plan and we tested that plan ahead of the census as well in the lead up to the census. So as much as a worldwide pandemic is truly a terrible thing, and we've all had ways that that's impacted our lives, there were actually some positives from a census perspective in terms of the quality and the outcomes that we see in the data. So with half of Australia in lockdown, we had more people at home, more people having an opportunity to respond to the census, and we did achieve a high response rate, which I'll get to at the moment, but also having more people staying at home and living together in the same, or being at home on census night in the same house means we actually see more complete household data. Things like household income, family income, things like that, that we have everyone together, we collect all of that information from the whole household unit. And that was, we saw more of that than we'd seen, more people at home than we'd seen in previous censuses. Also, with less people travelling overseas and more people returning home, we get a more complete picture of the whole Australian population because more people were in the country filling out the census form on census night than we've seen in many other censuses. So the data from 2021 really does provide a unique picture of Australia over the past 5 years, but significantly that snapshot being taken in the COVID-19 pandemic means we get a really unique picture of Australia in that COVID-19 moment. And we can see COVID insights in the data. International visitors dropped as was well expected, but we also saw, as I said, a decrease in the number of people who are away from home. And we'll have more information coming out in our second release in October that will have even more insights around work and migration and things like that. So in states that were open for travel, we did see an uplift of visitors from out of state. So Northern Territory and Western Australia saw an increase, and other states really saw a decrease in that were in lockdown, which is not a surprise. And the data, all of this means that we did want to make sure our data was high quality, and we could see that we were confident in the quality, but we still had our independent assurance panel review the data with considerations of COVID impacts and all the other considerations that they stepped through. And the panel found the data was fit for purpose and consistent in quality with previous censuses. So that was certainly the result that we were expecting and looking for. And while this was a unique time, all of these indicators and the ones I'm about to talk through really lead us to be very happy to say that the data is of high quality and a true snapshot of Australia and of New South Wales, of course. So let's have a quick look at the high-level quality indicators. We have our response rate, which despite the challenges that lockdowns posed, we still achieved that 96.1% for all of Australia and 96% for New South Wales, which is an excellent result. Our response rate in 2016 was 95.1%, so we exceeded that this time around. 2021 census had a 0.7% undercount for all of Australia and a 0% undercount for New South Wales. So that net undercount is that net position that considers all the people that the census may have missed but should have counted, and then all of the people that the census counted potentially more than once, double counted in the census, and balances out to be what is the what ends up being the net undercount. So we didn't actually for New South Wales, we're not saying that we missed nobody. What we're saying is that that it evened out in terms of the very small number that we would have missed, which we 96%, and we actually worked out our undercount was about 3.8%, and our overcount in terms of double counting people who may have found their way to potentially being on a form more than once, or we imputed in areas where we actually did count people, things like that, that we ended up with a 3.8% overcount, so that nets out to 0. So let's keep moving on. We did also, I should also say, our online response rate much higher than in 2016, about 20% higher, and 78.9% for Australia, and even higher in New South Wales, which isn't that surprising with people locked down and not much to do but be on the internet and filling out their census form. So thank you very much. So let's get into the data. We collect data in the census on people, households, families, and dwellings. And so we're going to start with people and work our way through those different high-level themes. Yeah, let's get into the people side of things now. And I will start with some high-level big picture context. Here's Australia and all of the states. We can see that overall, we did have a lot of growth across Australia. So that's the population growth from 2016 to 2021. We can see that ACT was by far the highest at 14.4%, and that's the second census in a row that ACT's been higher than other states and territories, but that's followed by Victoria and then Queensland and then Tassie and then New South Wales. So New South Wales about in the middle in terms of that growth, and very similar to the growth that we saw of the overall Australian population of about 8.6%, and the overall population of Australia now grown to 25.4 million. But we're not talking about all of Australia in this session. We're focused on New South Wales. So let's zoom in a bit to that. And 7.5 million people in the last census. That's grown to just over 8 million in this time. And as I said, that's about an 8% increase. And you can see the increases from the past few censuses on the slide. Very similar increase to what we saw from 2011 to 2016. But it's higher than what we saw prior to 2011. And if you go back further, you do see smaller growth as well from 2001 to 2006. So that has increased. And in fact, I think between 2006 and 2011, that 5.6% increase, that was one of the lowest growth rates than all states and territories. So now we're not seeing it quite in that same area in terms of New South Wales overall. It's about middle. So New South Wales has just under a third of the Australian population, 32%, but that proportion of the overall population has been falling slowly. So back in 1971, it was about 34%, and now it's down to 32. Not a major change over 50 years, but it has been declining in terms of New South Wales' share of the overall population. And we have made a bit of noise in the media and other things, just talking about the census and some interesting findings. We've talked a bit about the fact that Australia's population has more than doubled in the last 50 years since 1971. But as you can see from this slide, New South Wales has not. It has grown substantially, more than 85% increase since the 1971 census, but it hasn't more than doubled. So you can see why that proportion is just declining a bit in terms of the overall population. Moving on, have a bit of a look at a map here showing some SA3, Statistical Area 3, changes in both population on the left and dwellings on the right between 2016 and 2021. So some areas in the west and north there, notably, that are declining. That's the teal and the sort of green colour. That's notably Burke, Cobar, Coonamble, about a 10%, just over 10% decrease in population in those areas, and Moree and Narrabri, just under 4% decrease. Broken Hill in the far west, just a slight decrease at just under 2%, and Lachlan Valley, more like a 1% decrease. And that's in contrast to what we see along the coast and inland to areas like Tamworth, Dubbo, Orange, and Wagga Wagga. But we don't really see any of those sort of red areas that are, 50% or higher growth that we see in Greater Sydney. So there's none of those in regional New South Wales. But if we do zoom into the capital city of Sydney, the Greater Sydney region, then we do get a bit of a different picture. Now, the first thing you might notice is that high growth, percentage growth showing and similar decline in dwellings in the lower west area there. I just want to dispel any thought that that's a story or something really interesting, because what that is, in fact, is the south of the Blue Mountains, predominantly all national park, just a handful of people, very small number of dwellings. So very small changes make big percentage movements. So effectively, please ignore that. It does show up on our map in that way, but it isn't anything interesting, and it's showing higher change in population, but we're talking about very, very small numbers. So it's not much of a change at all. And the real stories here that I will talk about a bit are Rouse Hill and McGrath's Hill, the SA3 right in the middle of the map there that's showing up in red. The two SA3s, the other SA3 there is Blacktown North SA3. So Rouse Hill and McGrath's Hill had about a 70% increase in population, and Blacktown North had about a 54% increase in population. So those were the largest increases in population that we see at an SA3 level. And just to talk, I guess, a little bit about that, give a bit of interest in what we're seeing here and who's living in these areas. Rouse Hill and McGrath's Hill, the younger area, median age of 34 compared to 37 for Sydney. When you look into that in a bit more detail, that's because there's lots of families with kids. So 63% of the families in the area are a couple family with children, which is much higher than we see in the Australia mix of families. While most people are born overseas, most people are born in Australia. In Rouse Hill, more than 60% are second generation with at least one parent born overseas, is what I mean by that. So in fact, more than half have both parents born overseas. Of people living here. Incomes are quite a bit higher than the Sydney average. People are mostly living in separate houses, and a bit over half of these are owned with a mortgage. Blacktown North, SA3, the other one showing red there, is very similar in many ways to Rouse Hill and McGrath's Hill. In those things, younger, mostly families, higher incomes, living in separate houses and owned with a mortgage. But about half the people in Blacktown North were born overseas themselves, so first generation Australians, and there's quite a large community from India. We also saw big increases in Bringley Green Valley and closer to the city in Botany, so around 40% and 26% growth there. And the areas of decrease that you can see, that little green part on the left part in the population side, or teal, that you can see, that's the eastern suburbs south. It's about Coogee to La Perouse. It's about just under 5% decrease, or about 6,400 people. And if you look at the household sizes between those areas of increase and the household sizes of those areas in the eastern suburbs, you see a very big difference of around over 3 people per household, to just under 2.5 people, under the Australian average. About I can't remember exactly. I think it was about 2.2 people per household, 2.3. So quite some differences in terms of where people are living, how people are living, and where we see these population increases across Sydney. But I will stop talking right now and pass over to Caroline to keep taking us through more data on people.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to continue the story of the people, of the population of New South Wales, by presenting an age pyramid, demographer's favourite chart, I think. If you haven't seen one of these before, let me take you through it so that we know what we are looking at. On the left of the chart there are males. The y-axis is showing the age cohorts from 0 at the bottom in 5-year groups up to 85 plus at the top. And this is actually, I should have said, a chart of 2001 New South Wales population. So if I look at the males on the left, I can see that the 2 most common age cohorts presented there are between the ages of 35 and 40, and each of those groups represents about 3.8% of males in New South Wales. The same picture is on the right for females, showing that distribution of across the ages for females. And again, it is that age group between 35 and 44 that has the most people in it in New South Wales. The median age of the New South Wales population back in 2001 was 35, and that is the same as the Australian median at that time. So that was 2001. Let's have a look at what has happened as we fast forward to 2021. What I've just done there is overlay in the teal colour the 2021 proportions. And we can see quite some change over that time. So let me draw your attention to the 2 groups where we've got the most males is at a slightly younger age group. It is at the 30 to 39-year-old age group, so just 5 years younger than we saw in the 2001 figures. And if we look at the females, it's that same sort of pattern. But you can also look, if we compare those bars of the orange and the teal, teenagers and children, there's a shrinking proportion of the New South Wales population. And if we look at all the age groups over about 55, they've all grown. So really quite a changing shape of the New South Wales population in 2021. You'll notice, or you may notice, that I just referred to males and females in presenting that population pyramid. And you might recall from when you filled in your census form last year that the sex question did actually have 3 response options. The third response option was called non-binary sex. And that option was included to allow people who weren't able to identify as male or female to still be able to be participating in the census. But what we are doing for most of our data releases is releasing the male and the female data. And where a person has provided a non-binary sex response, that is actually imputed to either male or female and then included within that broader Australian data as a male or female sex. That's not meaning that we are not reporting on people who responded as non-binary sex. What we're actually doing is we're putting out a analytical article in a couple of months that will go deeper into the characteristics of people who responded with that non-binary sex option. And we're doing that because there are a lot of caveats and limitations in how that data should be used. So we're being very cautious about how that's being released, and we will be releasing that with all due consideration in a couple of months' time. But for now, when you look at most of the data on the ABS website, when you're looking at census data, it is all expressed as male and female. Going to move now on to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population of New South Wales. And starting with the total numbers. In 2021, there were 278,000 people in New South Wales who identified as either Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. And that represented 3.4% of the population of New South Wales at that time. And you can see that was a big growth. That was a growth of nearly 29% on the 2016 census. And that in itself was a growth of 25% on the previous census. So back in 2011, there were 172,000 people who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in New South Wales. And back then it represented 2.5% of the population compared to that 3.4% of the population that we saw last year in the census. Let me extend that in a graph to really make this clear, that growth we're seeing over the last 30 years here. These are the numbers on the left. This is a count of the population. So the first time point that I've got there is 1991, where it was nearly 70,000. And that's showing nearly a 4 times increase in the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in New South Wales. On the right, that's showing how it's changed as a proportion, because obviously the New South Wales population is growing at the same time. So it's gone from 1.2% back in 1991 forward to 3.4% in 2021. I'm going to have a look now at across the states and territories, because we are seeing that growth across a number of states and territories. So New South Wales on the top there, those figures I have already mentioned. Victoria also had really strong growth, much stronger growth, in fact, in the last 5 years, to a growth of 37.4% on 2016. But if we look at the numbers, so in those shaded columns on the left, you can see that New South Wales and Queensland continue to be the jurisdictions in which most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live, and in fact represent New South Wales. 34% of the population live in New South Wales, and 29.2% are living in Queensland. Let me have a look at that on a map. Again, here we are looking at the SA3, the Statistical Area 3 map of New South Wales, and what I'm showing there are the proportions of people in each of those SA3s who identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, with the darker colourings representing higher rates of identification, and the lighter shading representing lower rates. So you can see quite clearly there that most of the northwest of the state had a higher rate, and that's a rate of 12% or more. And most notably, that dark region there is the region of Burke, Cobark and Amble. Another region that's fairly high is Moree Narrabri, and that is a rate of 17.3%. And I didn't mention, but the Burke, Cobark and Amble rate is 24.2% of the population. I will say, though, that I had a closer look at the data and we saw that there was quite a high not stated rate to this particular question in both of those regions. So in the Burke, Cobark and Amble, about 16% of people who completed the census didn't actually answer the question on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin, and it was also a relatively high number in the Narrabri Moree region. So there might be some error, some bias in that response there for those areas. And now I'm just going to zoom into the Sydney Greater Metro area, and you can see there by the shading that the rates are much lower than in the regional areas. And the highest rates are in fact in Richmond, Windsor and Wyong, which is both 6.4%, and Mount Druitt's also 5.6%. So those outer western, the northern areas there, the not stated rates there aren't that high. They're about 5 to 7%. And all through the inner and middle suburbs of Sydney, you can see that there are lower rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm going to show you another population pyramid, this time just half of a population pyramid, so I'm not separating it into the male on the left and the female on the right, but just looking at 2 time points, one in the lighter shade there of peach being 2021 and the darker shade of orange being 10 years ago in 2011. And you can see here that compared to that population pyramid that I showed you earlier, there are more people in the lower age groups. The greatest share of the population are in those lower age groups. In fact, in 2021, 51.8% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in New South Wales were aged under 25 years. But that's actually a little bit down. It was 55.6% 10 years prior. What we can also see at the top of that graph is the increase in the proportion of the population who are older. So we're seeing that growth in the 55 to 64, the 65 to 74, and the 75 plus. So quite a changing of the profile of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in New South Wales in just that 10-year period. The census also collects a lot of data that can tell stories of cultural diversity in our community, and we'll go through some of them. But the questions that we ask around country of birth, we ask about ancestry, languages that people use at home, and also their religious affiliation. And when you start combining some of these data items, you can get quite a full picture of the cultural diversity of our community. So let's start with looking at the generations, and Mark referred to these earlier as we talk about first generation Australians. First generation Australians are those who were born overseas themselves. So in New South Wales, 31% of people were actually born overseas. That's a slightly higher rate than we see in Australia. The second generation are those who have one or both parents who were born overseas, and that's 22.9%, just about the same as the Australian figure. And together they make up more than half of the population of New South Wales were either born overseas or had one or both parents born overseas. So what countries is the population coming from? Well, 2/3, not quite, but nearly 2/3 of the population of New South Wales were born in Australia. And then you can see listed there the next 5 countries being China, England, India, New Zealand, and the Philippines. And that's a slightly different order to what we see in the Australian population, where England is number 2 and India is number 3. It's the same 5 countries, but in a different order. These are just the biggest communities in New South Wales, but I did want to point to another couple of emerging communities that have really grown in the last 5 years. They're not in the top 5, but of particular note are people born in Nepal. And that population has more than doubled in the last 5 years to about 65,000. And there are also people who are born in Syria. We see there's been an increase, not doubling, but an increase of about 80% of people born in Syria to about 16,000. Let me again have a look at a map. And what we're showing here is the proportion of the population in each of those SA3s who are born overseas. And many of the regional areas of New South Wales have an overseas born population of less than 13%. You can't really see it on this map because I'm not zoomed in enough, but the areas that are slightly higher than that are Wollongong at 21%, Queanbeyan at 18%, and the Southern Highlands at 18% as well. And for all of those areas, the most common country of birth after Australia was England. Mark did allude earlier to some of the cultural diversity that we see in Sydney when he was talking about the strong population growth that we're seeing. So here's a map just looking at the Sydney Greater Metro area and the proportion of people, again, who were born overseas. And you can see that is a very different picture to that country, New South Wales, that we just showed. So the highest rates in there are Auburn, 62%. Parramatta, 55%, and Fairfield, 56%. And there are a lot of other areas in there that are also shaded that dark burgundy colour. What I found really interesting when I had a closer look into this data was that each of those 3 areas I just mentioned have different source countries as their most common countries from which people came. So in Auburn, the countries where people mainly coming from were China, Nepal, and South Korea. Parramatta, the dominant country was India, and in fact 23% of people in Parramatta were born in India. And then when we go to Fairfield, the main countries of birth were Vietnam and Iraq. So look, we're doing these presentations for all the states and territories, and I haven't seen that pattern before. I think that's really an interesting observation of the diversity that we're seeing across that Sydney metropolitan area. This is one of the first slides to really show us about what's happened due to COVID in the 2021 census. We've got there on the left of the screen the number of people who have arrived, who are now living in Australia, who were born overseas and arrived during each of these years. So in 2016, about 86,000 people who are now resident in New South Wales arrived in New South Wales from overseas for the first time, creeping up a little bit in 2017, creeping up a little bit more in 2018, quite a large number in 2019 with 109,000. And that was, each of those figures were quite a share of the Australian migration that was coming in at the time, 35%. And then COVID struck in early 2020. So we can see the total number of people who were born overseas and moved to reside in New South Wales in 2020 was 41,000, and then an even smaller number in 2021, partly because that's the number arriving to the point of the census. So we conduct the census on the 10th of August. So at that time, 12,000 people had arrived from overseas and were settling in New South Wales. And both those figures in those COVID impacted years are representing a smaller share of the total number of arrivals in Australia. And as you would expect, the total number of arrivals in Australia during those 2 years were down, but the New South Wales share of that was down as well. Another way that we measure diversity is the languages that people use other than English at home. And I've got on this table on the left 1991, so going back 30 years in time, and on the right the current period. Back in 1991, 80% of the population spoke only English at home. When we got to 2021, that dropped. So it was 2/3 of the population only used English at home. So quite an increase in the number of people using a language other than English at home, and quite a shift in the languages that make up that those top 5 from, you can see on the left, Arabic being number 1 and it's being number 2 in 2021. Italian has slipped out of the top 5, Greek slipped out of the top 5, Cantonese is still there, Spanish has slipped out. So what we're seeing now in New South Wales in 2021, Mandarin is the dominant language other than English, which isn't surprising given that country of birth was China. And then we've had Vietnamese and Hindi added to those top 5, reflecting the movement of the increase in the number of Indian-born people into New South Wales. The final measure that I'm going to talk about, or indicator, I guess, of cultural diversity is people's religious affiliation and how that has changed over time. So now I am going back to 1986, and we're showing the proportion of people who responded with each of these major religious groups. The striking increase that you can see there in that teal shaded line is people who have reported no religious affiliation, and that includes people who report a secular or another spiritual type religious affiliation, and that has increased right up to 33.2% in 2021, which is 3 times the rate it was in 1986. But it is in fact at a lower rate than Australia. So Australia, the number of people with no religious affiliation was 38.9. So we're finding fewer people in New South Wales not reporting no religious affiliation. And then the other 3 lines that you can see, the quite large share there, are various Christian denominations. In the dark orange, people reporting Catholic. The yellow is people reporting Anglican, and then that peach colour again is people reporting other Christian. And you can see Anglican has now just dipped below other Christian. Another Christian includes people who are just reporting Christian as their response. So we are seeing people increasingly not reporting a specific denomination of a Christian religion that they follow, but preferring to say that they follow Christian, they are a Christian. So we're seeing the overall rate of people reporting that is decreasing, but there has been a slight increase in that other Christian above Anglican, but across the board, those Christian religions have decreased over that last period. And you can't see it too clearly, but what we're showing at the bottom of that chart is the emerging religions. Islam is the dominant one. And you can see that in the orange bar, but we can also see there Hinduism increasing because of more people coming from India, and Buddhism hasn't really grown, it's staying a little bit flat. And so Islam is 3.2% of the population, and Hinduism is now 2.7% of the population. So just a snapshot of the cultural diversity of the community. And I'm going to hand back to Mark, who will be talking about some of the new questions that we asked on the census last year.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I am indeed going to talk through some of the new questions which we're very excited about here in the census, and hopefully people out there are too, because there's some great information. I do just want to give a bit of context to the first question that I'll be talking about, the long-term health conditions. So just to show what the question was that we asked, it's on this slide. There were 10 selected health conditions, and these were chosen based on outcomes of stakeholder consultation, how common these conditions are, how the data collected can be used to inform services, policy and research and those sorts of things. And so we just asked this one single question. Has a person 1 been told, or person a person on the form been told by a doctor or nurse that they have any of these long-term health conditions? And then there's 10 selected conditions and the other or no long-term health condition. So it's not as comprehensive as our other health surveys that the ABS runs and some other sources which have detailed sets of questions to capture prevalence of each condition more accurately. But it is, the other thing to mention is this is the census, like all census questions, are answered usually by one person on behalf of the whole household. So that can potentially lead to underreporting in more sensitive topics, especially where people don't necessarily know the health conditions of everyone else in the household, or and generally in more sensitive questions, we can have people not wanting to disclose for various reasons of their own. But we still did get very high response to this question. So it's a question of whether in reporting on behalf of families and others in the household, whether people were able to accurately list all of the conditions that others have. So having said all that, I do want to talk about, it's not all caveats and problems with this question. We're really happy with the data that and how it can be used. Just using this single question allows the census to have this information and cross-classify it with all the other information that we collect on the census. That's one area where this is a really, really useful tool. The other part that's very powerful, and it's where the census is always at its most powerful, is looking at data for smaller population groups. For example, particular age cohorts or small geographic areas, people who are less proficient in English, a whole range of different, smaller population groups that you can see the proportions of people who have reported these different conditions. And that is a really useful and powerful research tool. We have published a conceptual article on this health topic, and it's available on our website just to help people understand the data collection methods, the strengths and limitations of the census health data compared to other sources and surveys. So please check that out if this is data that you are using for research. And just to give a sense of just how much value we can extract from this one question on the census, from this one question, we have created 30 different variables, things like counts of each condition, obviously counts of, the number of people who have more than one condition or one condition and those sorts of things, as well as counts of some defined comorbidities like asthma and lung condition and those sorts of things. So that's the background and understanding of the question itself. Looking at some of the data for New South Wales, nearly 2.2 million people who are usually resident in New South Wales reported having at least one of the selected long-term health conditions. That's about 27% of the state, and it's very similar to the Australian rate, which was 27.7%. So you can see how many there, 1.5 million for one health condition, and through to just 240,000 reporting they had 3 or more health conditions. So this is an interesting graph which shows how the long-term health conditions effectively change through the ages. So the age in 10-year brackets along the bottom axis, and the different colours representing 5 of the different selected health conditions, and the percentages of people who reported those conditions for the New South Wales population on the y-axis. So you can see, first of all, just an overview that right back at the sort of 0 to 9 years, it's the yellow line, the asthma line, that's the most commonly reported condition for kids. And then it's around 20 to 29 years that we start to see that blue line, the mental health condition, be the highest reported long-term health condition. And then once we get a bit further on, getting close to 60, we start to see arthritis take over, and then it's very much the highest reported condition across the population for the rest. And that's a very similar picture to what we see at the national level. And so, we're really looking here at New South Wales, but it is a common pattern, and not really a surprise given the types of conditions that we're talking about. So let's have a quick look at some of the different lines on this. First of all, that orange line, arthritis. Overall, arthritis is reported by just 8% of the New South Wales population, but when you look at it like this, you can really see how heavily it affects the older age brackets, and that dramatic rate increase from sort of 50, even 40 through to the older years. The asthma line is the yellow line, and it's often thought of as a condition for younger people. And as I said, it is the highest reported in children. But you can see that it very much stays quite constant throughout years. People are still reporting asthma and still living with and dealing with asthma in older years, but other conditions have grown and become more prevalent for those age groups. New South Wales is actually slightly lower than the national average for all age groups of asthma over 20 years old. So that is just something you can see in the data. Diabetes is the green line there, and it also has that later peak, in later life peak, but we also see people reporting this in the 30s and 40s too. And the New South Wales results here are very similar to the national picture. Heart disease is the purple line. Again, peaks later in life. It's quite similar to arthritis, but just not as high. And again, that's quite similar to the national results. And the mental health is the light blue there. It's the highest reported condition for all groups from sort of 20 to 50 years old. And New South Wales rates across all age groups are actually lower than the national rates by 0.5% to 1 percentage points. So that's interesting, and we'll have a bit of a closer look at that now on a map. So looking at mental health condition and the proportion of people who have reported it. So that really dark burgundy colour is sort of in the 11 to 14% of the population, and that lighter peach colour is 0 to less than 5. So the places that we see higher rates reported of mental health, we can see those the Hunter region and Newcastle and up the north coast there, Broken Hill and the far west and the Shoalhaven, all around sort of that 11%, as is Orange and Albury. And so we get, but actually the highest rate that we see is in Maitland, and that's at 13%. Now, those lower rates that we see in the top and central New South Wales, Moree, Narrabri, and Bourke, Cobark, and Amble, they're around 7%, 6 to 7%. But as Caroline pointed out, similarly in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander section, we did have a higher not stated rate than the average. So it's quite likely, and I talked about how this can be understated, it's quite likely that it's understated in these areas. So that is worth keeping in mind. If we look at Greater Sydney, then we do see, again, a bit of a different picture with generally lower rates than regional New South Wales. So the higher rates that you do see here, the Blue Mountains, about 11%, Marrickville, Sydenham and Petersham, nearly 12%, and Wyong is at about 12% as well. And the rates of 7% or below are right there through much of the inner and middle suburbs, except for that Sydney inner city. And we don't see the same not stateds in those areas. So those are more similar to what we're seeing in other areas, but reported at a lower rate. The other new question that we had on the census this time around was service in the Australian Defence Force. So this was where we asked people about their current and previous service in the Australian Defence Force. And the questions provide us with a really great data set showing just under 500,000 veterans, people who have previously served across Australia. We also have all that rich demographic information from the census that further helps us to target services to that community. So it's a really powerful data set, and I've just got the one sort of summary slide to just give a picture of the results from that for New South Wales. So it's about 2.3% of the Australian population aged 15 years and over who have served in the Australian Defence Force. That's 24,500 currently serving. We see about 130,000 who've previously served, and that total number there is about 150,000 of people who have ever served, are serving now, or have previously served, and that's about 2.3% of the New South Wales population, which compares to 2.8% of the Australian population, so slightly less, I guess, veterans as a proportion of the community in New South Wales. But some of the regions in New South Wales where you'll find higher numbers of veterans include Shoalhaven, Newcastle and Gosford, Wyong. So some interesting results, and definitely a valuable data set for service provision in areas like health and other things. So now we are going to move on to households and families, and before we then eventually get to talk about dwellings as well. So first up, we'll be talking about household composition. And in the census, households are categorised as either family households, lone households, or group households. Most people live in family households, but around 1/4 of households are lone person households. And those have been, households have been getting smaller in New South Wales. So 50 years ago, the average number of people per household in New South Wales was around 3.2. Now it's 2.6. I did mention those few areas in Sydney where we've seen that high growth, where the numbers were around 3.2, 3.3. And so there are still areas when you get down to a smaller level. But across New South Wales, we're now seeing about 2.6 people per household, and that has been decreasing over the years. And we've continued to see a slow increase in the number of lone person households and a decrease in both the family and group households over time as well. Let's take a look at a bit of a breakdown of the mix of families in New South Wales. So most common family type in New South Wales continues to be couples with children, although this has continued to decrease from being about half of all families around 25 years ago to now being around that 45% mark. And most of that movement has gone to the couples with no children, although we have seen the lone parent family proportions increase a little over that time as well. And Greater Sydney has a greater proportion of couple families with kids compared to New South Wales. So 45% or so in all of New South Wales, but it's 48.5% for Sydney. The last couple of slides I want to talk about before handing back to Caroline to cover off on dwellings is just to sort of focus a bit on same-sex couples and married and de facto same-sex couples that we count in the census. So looking at that, you can see that the data is across the states here, and I do want to make the point that we only collect data in the census for couples who are living together, so effectively filling out the census on the same form. There were 26,800 or so same-sex couples in New South Wales, and that represents about just over 34% of all same-sex couples in Australia, which is slightly more than the New South Wales state proportion of the population at 32%. And across Australia, married couples made up just over 30% of all same-sex couples, 30.5%. And in New South Wales, it's very similar, but slightly lower at 30.2%, I should say. But we can see that this has been a real increase over the years in the number of people, same-sex couples counted in the census. So a very steady increase from 1996 on there, showing on the slide over that 25 years, but then a bit of a steeper increase between 2016 to 2021. So we counted 10,000 more couples represented in that, and that increase is about 60% on the 2016 numbers. So that is my last slide. I'm going to hand back to Caroline, and I'll see you a bit later for any questions.
Thank you, Mark. I am going to go through the final little bit of data, which is on dwellings, but I will put in a reminder about questions. We are receiving quite a few coming through, but in case you didn't write down that address earlier when Mark had it on the screen, go to a website, www.pollev, that's POLLEV.com/2021 census DS NSW for Data Seminar New South Wales. Hope you got that and put through the questions, but we are seeing quite a few come in, and once I've gone through this little bit of data on dwellings, we'll start taking your questions. Let me start by talking about the tenure type. So how do we own, or how do we pay for the types of dwellings that we are living in? So here's an infographic of 2021 showing a fairly even spread across people who own their home outright, 31.5%, in the middle 32.5% own with a mortgage, and on the right 32.6% rent their property. And this is quite different to the patterns we see in other states, and it is different to the national story, where we're just seeing that even split. And I've got a graph on the next page that will show that even more clearly. But in the national figures, we see there are more people in the owned with a mortgage category and fewer in the rented. So it's slightly different spread across New South Wales. Let me go to a time series here, and as you can see on the right of that screen, showing that really quite even spread of the 3 tenure types in 2021, and also it was a similar type of spread back in 2016. So the number of homes, we just focus now on that dark orange bar, the number of homes that were owned outright back in 1996 is about the same number as we see owned outright in 2021. It's about 926,000. So the same number of dwellings, despite the dwelling stock increasing significantly in that time, the same number of dwellings were owned outright both in 96 and in 2021. And as I said, there's that very even distribution of the dwelling types. But if we go back to 1996, you can see that that nearly over 900,000 dwellings, that represented 45.4% of dwellings were owned outright. And then that middle bar, about a quarter of all dwellings were owned with a mortgage, and then that was about 31% were rented, which is not that much lower than the proportion of rented dwellings in 2021. There has been a lot of coverage about unoccupied dwellings and what that might mean, particularly in the current days of people finding it really difficult to get a rental property or to buy a property, and potentially increasing number of people living in a homeless type situation. And so there has been a lot of conversation in the media about how many unoccupied dwellings that we have around, and could they just still be filled with the people who can't find accommodation. So I'm going to break that down a little bit more, and I will just say at the start that the scale on this graph is a little bit misleading because we're starting at 8.5% there, so it's showing quite large changes, but it's just to do with the scale. So let me first tell you what unoccupied dwellings refers to. It's quite simply dwellings that were unoccupied on census night. Now, they might be dwellings that are normally occupied and the person is just away for that night or that week. They can be properties, and it's quite common, can be properties where people have a second home. So it might be that they've got a holiday house and the holiday house is unoccupied at the time of the census, but they're living in their house in Sydney, which is occupied. So that is contributing to the unoccupied dwelling count. And then there are also things like dwellings that have just been newly completed and people haven't quite moved in yet. So there might have been either new houses or new apartments built that people haven't quite moved into, but they are able to be habited. And then on the opposite end of the scale, dwellings that are still able to be lived in but are about to be demolished, and no one's living in them. And of course, the dwellings that are actually available for let for people ready to move in to. So looking at the numbers here, well, sorry, not the numbers, I've got the proportions here of dwellings that were unoccupied. And I'm showing here Australia in the peach colour and New South Wales in the teal colour. And so in Australia in 2021, just over 10% of dwellings, of the entire private dwelling stock, was unoccupied. And in New South Wales, that was a little bit lower. That was 9.4%. And that represents about 300,000 dwellings. You can see both of them have decreased on 5 years ago. So there were a greater proportion of dwellings unoccupied both in Australia and in New South Wales in the 2016 census. And in fact, there even a decrease on what we saw 10 years ago in the 2011 census. what type of dwellings are we living in? This is the census also asks classifies dwellings according to their structure, and that dark teal colour that you see is separate houses. So you can see on the left of the chart there 2001, and on the right of the chart 2021. And you can see across all of those 4 bars, the dominant dwelling structure that people were living in was still a separate house. And if I compare Sydney to the rest of New South Wales, so in Sydney, it's just about 52-53% of people are living in a separate house compared to the rest of New South Wales, where it's just over 80% are living in a separate house in 2021. And in Sydney, far more people are living in flats or apartments, and particularly those larger flats or apartments that are 4 or more stories, and also a proportion in smaller flats or apartments or semi-detached and townhouses. And that's where we've seen a real shift over the last 20 years when we're looking at Sydney, a real increase in those people living in flats or apartments in a 4 or more story block, and fairly similar proportions for the other dwelling structures. I did find it interesting. You can just see it as a little sliver at the top of the New South Wales bar, that there are a small proportion of people in the rest of New South Wales starting to live in flats or apartments in a 4 or more story block. And it was barely there in 2001, but that is increasing a little bit. So that's all the data that we're going to go through today. But what's next? This isn't the end of the census. In fact, this is only our first release from the census. And in our first release on the 28th of June, we released a lot of data from the census onto our website. And we've touched on a few of those topics today, not all of them, but we've touched on quite a few of them. But the others are all available for you to find yourself on the website. And then we've still got another big release coming in October. Date's still to be confirmed, but put sometime in October in your diary, because that's when we're going to release our second lot of data from the census. And I think this is going to be really interesting because it will contain all our data about labour force, so about people's employment statuses, their occupations, the industries that they worked in, how many hours they've worked, and how that's actually changed over time. And I expect that we will see in New South Wales and potentially in Sydney to a greater extent, quite a change in people's employment status due to the effects of COVID over some time. In our second release, we do also put out some more education data, and in particular, we're looking at what non-school qualifications people have, so what their field of study is and also what their level of study is. Is it a Cert 3? Is it a bachelor degree? And all that data comes out in October. Another one that I'm looking forward to seeing is a method of travel to work. We always ask a question about how did you get to work on census day for those who do have a job at the time, and I'm expecting to see a lot more people choosing to say that they're working from home. So there always has been a proportion of people that report working from home, but I'm sure we've all experienced it ourselves over the last couple of years. We're working a lot more from home. So in October, we'll see what that number is, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that number might change or vary across the country. The other big data of interest coming out in October is what we refer to as internal migration. And they are the questions about where did you live 1 year ago and where did you live 5 years ago? And we've certainly heard anecdotal stories about people who have moved interstate. Maybe they've moved from the city into a regional area, and it's aligning with their work from home practices. So that will be another big story that we will look forward to in October. And what we intend to do is, after we've released that data, we will again have seminars like this one on what we are seeing in the data. And if you missed it, we did also have a national data seminar a couple of weeks ago, and that's available on the ABS website if you want to look that up. But we'll be doing a similar set of presentations in October or early November to share the results from second release with you. And then we keep working and we release even more data early next year. And they're things that are a little bit more complex, I guess, to process. Things like our socioeconomic index for areas, so the CEFA, our estimates of homelessness, actually calculating the distance travelled to work, the Australian Census longitudinal data set, and we add in another level of geography, which is remoteness areas. So all that data to look forward to in 2023. I'm going to just quickly point you to the website, because that's where you can get access to all this data. We've only given a little snippet of what is available, but I encourage you, if you are interested at all in census data, that you go and have a look at some of it for yourself. And the way to do that is we've got a tool at the left of your screen. It's just called Find Census Data. And there's two ways that you can find data on the census. You can find data by topic, and you probably can't see the details there, but they're topics like health and cultural diversity and housing. So if you want to see some data that we've already put together for you in any of those themes, click on the search by topic. Or if you're interested in data for a particular geographical region, that might be your suburb, that might be your postcode, it might be an electoral district, you can do search census data. We've focused our presentation today on SA3 areas, but people often relate more to things like their local government area or their census. So you can type in there your area of interest, and you can either get what's called a quick stats, a nice quick and easy snapshot of your area, or go into more detailed spreadsheets that present a lot more detail. And the final thing that I'm going to refer you to is the Census Dictionary. Census Dictionary is an excellent reference source for everything about census data. We have listed all the variables that we release from the census, and we go into quite a bit of detail on each of them. So we defined what that variable means, the scope of it. So some questions are only asked of people who are aged over 15, for example, and so that will define the scope that the population that it applies to, what categories the data is presented in, how the variable is created, and even the questions, copies of the questions that the variable was created from, and importantly, how that variable has actually changed over time and what you might need to think about as you're using the data. And one thing that we include in those data use considerations is what's called the item non-response rate. And that is also compared to what the item non-response rate was in 2016. So that's all the data and a very quick tour of the website for you. And what I'm going to do now is introduce Leanne Luong. Leanne is the ABS's strategic partnership manager for New South Wales, and she is hosted by New South Wales Treasury. And I welcome Leanne now to ask questions of Mark and I.
Thank you, Carolyn. Just a reminder, if you have any questions regarding the seminar today, you can submit them at www.polev.com/2021 Census DS NSW. And as we speak, we have a question that's come through. So this is directed at Caroline, I believe. What other seminars will you be running to explain the census data in more detail?
Okay, thanks for that question, Leanne. So we are doing over the next few weeks seminars for each of the states and territories. This is just the second one that we've done. We did Victoria earlier this week, and we will be doing all the other jurisdictions over the next few weeks. And we also did both a national data seminar last month, and we have done an Indigenous seminar already. All of those are available on the website, the ABS website already. And so if you're interested in another jurisdiction or the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander picture, then yes, certainly get on the website and look at those. But coming up, we are planning for our first release data, probably sometime in late August, I think. We're going to be doing a seminar that's focused on health. So Mark today took you through some of the insights that we're able to get into people's health conditions from the census, and we're going to devote a whole seminar to health. And I think what we might do as well is touch on some of the other data that the ABS collects on health and how they compare and contrast, because I think that's a useful comparison that Mark indicated is a consideration that people need to give when using health data. But I think we'll do a seminar on that later in August. The other big one that's coming up for first release will be a cultural and linguistically diverse or cultural diversity focused seminar. So I touched on quite a few of the measures of cultural diversity in New South Wales, but we're going to do a seminar focused on more areas, more populations, communities of interest. And we'll again do that probably late in August. And we will advertise those on our website. And it'll be like you did to join today through an Eventbrite invitation, but they'll also be available on the website later. Then if I fast forward a few months, we're not going to be doing a seminar on the Defence Force for first release, because we're going to do a bigger one, a more comprehensive one after second release, because I think there's going to be some really interesting observations that we can see of people who have served in the Defence Force when we look at that with their occupation or their internal migration, so where they've lived. So that will be a seminar coming after second release, and then there'll be a whole lot of other seminars after second release. So we haven't quite worked through yet, but you can expect that we will have a number after the data comes out in October that will do state and national, and probably a couple of key topic-based ones as well. So I feel like we're going to be busy for quite some time talking to the community, to data users about what we found in the census.
Great, thanks, Caroline. So another question. This one's for Mark, I believe. How does the ABS know the response rate? Noting the response rate was 96%. How was it calculated?
Yeah, so the response rate is that the one that we've reported there is a dwelling response rate, and that basically when we have the count of dwellings across Australia, and we do count both dwellings and people in the census. So we get that. We have to go right through our processing phase to have that final stock of dwellings and be confident we have sort of a working response rate as we work through the census to get a picture of how complete we're going during our collection phase. But it's not until quite late in the processing piece where we have that final count of dwellings. And it's not just a count of dwellings, it's also then we apply our occupancy to that, where it's what dwellings are we actually expecting a response from. So we have a proportion of the dwellings which are unoccupied and deemed unoccupied. And as Caroline said, that can just be unoccupied on census night. It doesn't mean long-term unoccupied or it's not in use, but we get field intelligence from our people in the field who are able to see if something's likely to be occupied or get that indication. And then we have various administrative data sources, and we do create an occupancy model, which we use where we've got no other information. Or where to verify the information that we do have, and we go through a whole process of sort of reconciliation around occupancy, and then work through that to say, well, if we didn't receive a form from a dwelling which we know is there, and we believe it was occupied, our occupancy model or our field intelligence or both are telling us that it was occupied, then we're able to say that that was a missed dwelling, and if we did receive a form, I mean, most of our occupancy determination comes from receiving completed forms. So we receive completed forms for the vast majority, and then we determine the number of dwellings left and work out whether we're expecting. And we need to do that because we also do the process of imputation, where we create statistical records for areas to complete the census data to make sure we're not lowering the count in areas where we haven't covered all dwellings, where we've got that 3.9% for the nation, and that can be a bit bigger in some areas and smaller in others. Then we do this process of imputation to complete the census data set. So that's an important way that we make sure that our overall census counts are accurate, and what we feed into our official population estimates, the ERP, estimated resident population, is accurate and is something that can be that can go forward from there. So there's also the undercount component. We do a post-enumeration survey to further check, and that's a huge survey of lots of households to say, were they home on census night? Were they, had they completed a census? Should they have completed a census? Those sorts of things, to then find out that undercount measure, which is another important measure and feeds also through to our official population estimates. Hope I've answered that question well enough, Leanne.
Thanks, Mark. We have a question about long-term health conditions. Is there data about long-term health conditions and cultural diversity?
Yeah, I'll take that as well. There certainly is. You can cross-classify the long-term health conditions question with anything else on the census form, but I will add in just I guess a word of caution around that when doing that sort of research, and it might be obvious based on the graph that I put up already that showed the differences across age, but we do have very different groups. So in cultural diversity, Caroline mentioned emerging communities like people who are born in Nepal. They're going to be a younger group and therefore going to have less long-term health conditions just as a factor of age. So where you are doing comparisons and you're really looking for differences in either cultural diversity or other small population groups, one thing you really need to check is what is the age of the population you're measuring versus the age of the overall population of Australia, and how do you balance for that age by looking at just a proportion of that 65 plus or other statistical methods of taking out the age effect, so you can really do a more accurate comparison, but you can certainly look.
Mark, there's another question about long-term health condition. Were there any specific validation or quality assurance processes applied to the health conditions question? For example, confrontation of the data with Medicare data?
Yeah, so we do go through a quite comprehensive validation process for all of our questions on the census, and we look at whatever sources we have. Often that would involve the previous census, but with a new question like long-term health conditions, we can't compare to the previous census, and so we can't do that. But we do look at other sources as well. Predominantly, what we would compare and have compared the long-term health conditions question to is other ABS surveys, and noting the caveats that I put around that question and expectations that there could be some underreporting and those sorts of things. We're able to get a good sense of how people have responded to that question. It's something that we will continue to confront and look at other data sources and continue to evaluate the quality of that question as we look at move into our topic consultation processes and other things. We're always looking at how do we improve census questions and the way that we engage with the public on answering those questions to ensure that we get the highest possible response rate, item response rate, as well as an understanding, are people interpreting that question correctly and giving us the correct response. So we do that, not necessarily Medicare, but that is something that we could do more so in the future.
I might just add to that, Mark, before we get the next question. The conceptual article that you pointed to earlier has got a great table in it that looks at the prevalence rates, or the proportion of people who reported the various health conditions in the census compared to the National Health Survey and compared to another survey that we run, the Patient Experience Survey. And that allows you to understand why, what the differences are. And there's a lot of context around that about why the differences might be occurring. And so if you are using data, I believe we've got a very large survey about to be delivered. I think it's either today or tomorrow, a mental health survey. And if you wanted to compare what you're seeing in mental health from the census to what you see in mental health from the mental health survey, it's really useful to understand the benefits, but also the limitations of each of those different sources of data.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Caroline. There's a question around analytical articles. For example, Journey to Work. Will that be available? So Journey to Work is an article that, well, in fact, Journey to Work was developed as an interactive map after the 2016 census. We had a tool that allowed you to look at where a person's home address was and where their workplace address was, and understand the proportion of people travelling in that direction and what mode of transport that they took. That was a good tool. We aren't actually replicating that tool for 2021, but we will have quite a bit of data available around Journey to Work. So we will have data about the mode of transport and various combinations of mode of transport, as well as the distance travelled. So that will be released. And as I was saying when I was talking about the second release articles, I think that second release data, that's going to be quite interesting, because we're going to see changes to how people have previously travelled to work. So yes, there will be an article on that coming out post second release. Thanks, Caroline. Another question, I think Caroline will be able to answer this. What proportion of New South Wales population speak a language other than English?
Well, okay, well, I can tell you about the data that we collected, and that is just the main language other than English that people use at home. So I think we said about a third of the population use a language other than English at home, but there are more people than that who speak a language other than English. So there are probably quite a few people who do speak a second language, but we don't ask about multiple languages that people speak, but it is about a third of people speak a language other than English at home.
Then what would be the approach for the next census for those who identify as LGBTQI+, as non-binary may not cover all?
I can probably take that one as well. So I talked about non-binary sex and how we asked the sex question in the 2021 census. We did not ask a question on gender identity. We did not ask a question on sexual orientation, and we didn't ask a question on people who have variations in sex characteristics. And I did mention the real caution that we're taking with data from that question where we added non-binary sex as a response category, because it doesn't represent a population of people who are trans or who have intersex variations or who are gender fluid or non-binary gender. So that's what we did in 2021. But in the lead up to the census, we ran a public submission and consultation process, and we'll be doing that again for the next census. And what we do in that process is we go out and we ask data users in the community what do they want to see on the next census, and we have an open consultation process, and we get in lots of responses. I think in the 2021 consultation period, we got in 450 submissions for suggestions of what we could do in the census. And of course, we can't do all of that, but we were thrilled to be able to add 2 new questions to the census, being the long-term health conditions and the service with the Australian Defence Force. But as part of that submission process, we did also get interest being expressed in some of those LGBTI type indicators, say sexual orientation, gender identity as examples, and they were shortlisted for consideration. And we went through quite a comprehensive assessment process for including those questions into the census. But when we got to the final recommendations and what actually progressed into the census, it was just the 2 that progressed. But as we head towards 2026, that consultation process will commence again next year, and there'll be another submission process, and I expect that there'll probably be submissions and interest again from people with for interest in data needs on LGBTI plus communities. And I will say that we have worked very closely with a number of community organisations and peak bodies in this space to understand the data needs and some of the collection sensitivities associated with those data. So I think we're well progressed in our understanding, and I fully expect, and we've seen on social media, real concern when the data was released that we didn't have any LGBTI measures in it. So I fully expect that we'll be continuing that conversation as we lead towards the 2026 census.
Thanks, Caroline. Next question is on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So what is the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in New South Wales?
So the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in New South Wales is 3.4%, and that has increased from 2 point something percent. I had that on a slide. So the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander of the total New South Wales population is 3.4%.
Great. And what is the proportion of people who use an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander language at home in 2021, and how does that compare to 2016?
Okay, yeah, we didn't really talk about this, but in the In the question on languages, we did actually make a little bit of a change to the way the online form was asked, so that if people who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, they got in their response options that came up, they got an option to write in an Aboriginal, tick a box, or write in the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander language that they spoke. So we did see an increase in that from the previous census, and we saw it was, I've just been given the number here, 1.9% of people in New South Wales spoke an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander language at home. And if I get my pronunciation right, let me give you a go. Wiradjuri is the most common, and then a broader Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language not otherwise classified. And I'm not even going to have a go at the couple that I've got on the list, but I did point earlier to the Quick Stats product that we have on our website that you can look up for any of the areas of interest, your suburbs. And so we do have on that, we've got an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Quick Stats. And if you go to that for New South Wales, that will give you information just about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population of your area of interest. And that's where my helpful helpers here have pulled out some numbers for me.
Thanks. We have time for one more question. The last one would be, what surprised you the most about the findings for New South Wales? Either one of you would like to answer?
Well, Caroline's done most of the heavy lifting in the last few questions, so I don't mind going first. For me in New South Wales, and I live in New South Wales, I've lived in Sydney all my life. I think it was definitely a bit of a surprise seeing just how much the no religion, for example, increased at the Australia level. And when I was drilling into the New South Wales data and trying to understand more about New South Wales, seeing how much lower the no religion response was in New South Wales, and then in Sydney even lower again, and really then just sort of teasing apart the migration impact on the religion question and seeing that diversity in religion, some of those other religions that Caroline's talked about that have grown in the Sydney space, and then as you look at within Sydney in different areas, you see, some of those high growth areas I was talking about, no religion responses were more like 25% instead of the nearly 40% that we see nationally. So, that diversity, as well as, some religious sort of pockets across Sydney are very interesting. But then if you travel north and head to Newcastle, you get very high, 45% sort of no religion responses. And in those sorts of regions, you get very low number of people who are born overseas and that. So you can really see that migration effect and that cultural effect on things like religion. And so I did find that really interesting and a little bit surprising as I was looking through to just see how much of an impact that was.
And I'm actually going to talk about an item that we didn't mention today. That's the number of motor vehicles that households have. And I shouldn't be surprised, I guess, but I was surprised. We collect that data on the number of motor vehicles in a house. And what we see when we look at the New South Wales data is that there are more people who have no motor vehicles. And maybe that's people who are living, I talked about the increase of people living in apartments, and maybe they're living closer to walking distance to where they're shopping and working and socialising. But we do see a higher rate of people who have no or only one motor vehicle in New South Wales compared to Australia, and fewer proportions correspondingly of people who have 4 or more motor vehicles. So I thought that was interesting observation about New South Wales data.
Thank you both. Well, if you have any question that hasn't been answered today, you can send them to clientservices@abs.gov.au. I'll close the session by thanking the presenters and all the people who have helped to make this session possible. So thank you for tuning in. Have a great day.